Okay, so this is going to be a preliminary discussion on the notion of variable scope. And a variable scope really refers to a variable's visibility within a program. And this is going to become more of an issue for us now that we're dealing with methods and breaking up our program into smaller chunks. So let's take a look at this. This is just a basic Windows Forms application. There's nothing going on. I actually have 4 methods in the code here. This is a special method that belongs to the form, which will make sense to us in the weeks to come. It's an auto-generated method, so that's not one that I typed. We have the form load event, which is a method. That's an event handler, which is another special kind of method that's associated with an event happening, in this case, the form being loaded into memory. And then I have these 2 methods, method A and method B, which I typed out. They're just very, simple skeletal methods, no return type, no parameters. But I just want to use these to show you something about variable scope. So when I create a variable inside of a method, inside of the curly brace sandwich, if you will, I'll create an integer called a, because we're in method a, and maybe I'll set it to 0. Okay, so I've created this integer variable inside of method a. And the thing is, when you create a variable inside of a method, that variable's scope is limited to that method, meaning this variable a only exists inside of this method and can only be seen by this method. So if I come around here and I say I want to set a equal to 10, well, I couldn't even do it. Like, it wouldn't even, my IntelliSense filled in something else. Okay, so there it is, and as you can see, the compiler is complaining, and it says name A does not exist in the current context. And this is the compiler's way of saying, A, who's A? What are you talking about? I don't know what A is. So you have to be mindful of scope. So this is, sometimes you might hear this called procedure or procedure level scope, or method level scope. It's just, very limited. Another thing, this is kind of less important, but it is something I want you to start thinking about, is the lifetime of the variable as well. The lifetime of the variable is how long that variable actually exists in memory. And, getting back to this variable, once method A is done running, it's only going to run a split second in memory. And then once that method is done, A falls out of memory. We'd say at the end of the method here, A falls out of memory, meaning poof, it's gone. It no longer exists in the program. Again, we'll see ways around that of like kind of making it stay in memory, but later on. But I want you to start thinking about in terms of obviously scope, but also, to a lesser extent, the lifetime of the variable. Okay, so just to underscore this fact, in here I'll create int b equals 1. Okay, this variable b, again, we have procedure level scope or method level scope, where only method b has access to this integer variable b. If I try to go in here and say b, well, see, it won't even let me type b right away. B equals 2. Again, I'm getting that same error that it does not exist in the current context, so we can't do that. Okay, so now how do we get around this? We have gotten around this. This isn't the first time this issue is coming up for us, but like in the past, some of our programs dealt with arrays where you're like going back and next through a set of parallel arrays or something, and I always had you create those arrays up at the top, right inside of the start of the form class, the beginning of the form class. And this will be called a module level or class level variables. Okay, let's take a look at that. So I'm going to say int c equals 10. Okay, so I have variable c, which is at the class level. It's not inside of a specific method. It's at the top of the class, so it's not contained within a method. So I'm going to come down here into method A and say c equals 11. Okay, no problem, right? I'm going to come into method B and say C equals 12. Again, no problem. So what does that tell you about scope? When you have a module level or class level variable, the scope is wider, okay? This variable can be seen. Let's say this can be seen by all methods of the class, okay? So again, you know, the scope is more relaxed with a class level variable, and then all of the methods can see that. And I mean, sometimes that is absolutely necessary, like you saw with our arrays, when you have these multiple events or methods, event handlers having to work with those arrays, then we had to put them up at the top there. So I think as a rule of thumb, now this is just a preliminary discussion, so I'm going to you know, try to keep it short here. But just as a rule of thumb, you should always create your variables as locally as possible. Like if you know that you're working with method B and this a variable is only going to be used within method B and nobody else needs to see it, then that's where you should create that variable. But if as soon as more than one method or sandwich, so to speak, has to deal with that variable in the program, then it's got to be at the class level. It's got to be, okay? And one more thing about parameters. You know, now that we're dealing with methods, we've talked about parameters. If I have a couple of parameters here, P1 and P2, these are just variables, okay? But parameters are just variables, but they're variables that belong to the method and are used solely by that method. And the scope of these variables is limited to that method. So that's really the parameter, the notion of a parameter is a variable of limited scope to that method, and no other methods can touch those. So if I, again, just to prove my point here, if I say P1 equals 1, okay, again, I get that. What are you talking about error from the compiler? The parameters can only be seen and used by the method to which they belong.